You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
Benefiting from remaining outside of 2 world wars and later from not taking sides in the Cold War, Sweden was one of the countries that persistently pursued a policy of neutrality. However, there was a very different Sweden in the 17th century. It was a Nordic nation, a powerful country that had conquered many lands in Europe. It was known as the Swedish Empire, and neutrality was never in the empire's vocabulary until they launched their invasion of Russia, forcing Sweden to abandon its ambitions for war once and for all. So, what happened before? Let's look back to see how powerful and formidable this empire once was. This is Swedish territory from 60, and this is also Sweden. But in 60, from the 16th century to the 17th century, Swedish territory continuously expanded throughout Northern Europe and Europe, accompanied by countless wars and conquest from the empire. The Divine Code extended to Russia, the Polish Federation, Denmark, and the Netherlands, which were constantly forced to cede land to stop. But why could Sweden so easily crush such formidable rivals in Europe? The answer comes from this man, George the Great of Sweden. He was the one who built the empire of this nation during his reign from 1611. Death on the battlefield in 1632. Sweden's power spread throughout the region. The miracle originated from his efforts to strengthen the army. At that time, the armies of countries around the world were mainly composed of peasants and mercenaries who were paid to the point of resorting to robbery. But George the Great became the first king not to implement a system of conscription of mercenaries across the continent. Instead, he implemented a different system. Conscription. He used a law to select 1 man out of 10 to gather all men aged in Sweden. This policy led to Sweden possessing a standing army of over 36,000 men. Being a regular, all these soldiers were thoroughly trained and disciplined under the strict training of the king. The Swedish army began to tactical formations at the company level, ensuring unity instead of the cumbersome, disorganized formations composed of different elements. The 17th century was also a time when the world gradually changed from swords and spears to guns and cannon. And Gustavus was very quick to mass gunpowder weapons and equip his army. In addition, he also created a formidable artillery force, while European armies at that time large, cumbersome cannons that were difficult to transport to the battlefield without 4 war horses or fire. The Swedish artillery switched to using lighter, improved field cannons, allowing them to easily transport cannons to the battlefield using a donkey or horse. The code significantly increased the effectiveness of the support points for the soldiers throughout the battle. These innovative military reforms helped the Swedish army surpass its European rivals in both combat capabilities and mobility, and enabled King Gustav to deliver shocks to the enemy on the battlefield. A practical example is during the 30 Years' War. Sweden led 40,000 troops to the Champa Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a collection of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Eastern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Western Poland, the Czech Republic, and, however, from Northern Europe, the Kingzers brought powerful armies southward. He conquered half of the Holy Roman Empire. The Swedish army advanced like a storm, southward as if uninhabited, eventually reaching Austria. The capital the Holy Roman Empire. They then forced the Holy Roman Emperor to acknowledge the gods of the Swedish army. Participating in the war included Swedes, Finns, various mercenaries, and even prisoners were given food in the barracks. Although the formation was multi-component, they all possessed very high discipline. It was this good discipline that allowed the Swedish army to coordinate closely in multi-directional battle formations to break through the old square formation of the German Empire. However, in the Battle of Les in September 1631, the army, consisting of two wings of 23,000 Swedish soldiers and 18 sergeant, almost completely wiped out the entire force of 1,000 imperial soldiers, suffering only 500 casualties. In many other battles, this discipline allowed the soldiers to calmly march through artillery fire. They would approach the enemy, unleash a barrage of artillery fire at close range, and then use muskets, bayonets, and even swords for close combat. This close quarters combat tactic severely shocked the enemy and caused them to quickly collapse. This military foundation continued to bring many more victories for Sweden, even when King Gustavus was not in battle. In 1632, like the Swedish-Danish War, 1660, war led by King Peter X ended with Denmark ceding nearly half its territory to Sweden. For 30 years after the death of Peter the Great, Sweden continued to expand at a tremendous pace. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, and Russia were constantly forced to retreat, and Sweden gained vast territories, becoming a major power in the Baltic region. Looking at a map, this sea area has almost become a lake belonging solely to Sweden. It can be said that early military advancements helped the Swedish army become a formidable force in medieval war. However, these territorial expansion campaigns were not enough to fully demonstrate the capabilities of this empire. The early 18th century saw Sweden not only defeat a few individual countries, but also overcome an entire alliance against it. This alliance, initiated by Peter the Great of Russia, consisted of members such as Russia, Denmark, and, during the late 17th century, shared a common goal to reclaim territories lost to the Swedish army. Then, led by the newly enthroned King Charles XI, not yet 18 years old, led an attack on Copenhagen in July 1700. They then sailed through storms to intercept the Polish army heading towards Livonian, crushing them before quickly retreating to the Navarre fortifications to await the approaching Russians. In November, at the foot of Navarre's 1,000 Russian troops were routed by 1,000 Swedish soldiers, forcing them all to surrender or flee. This victory over the Allied powers brought Sweden fame throughout Europe. Charles Semwell, hailed as the Lion of the North, or invincible, comparable to the king himself. Such a great empire, throughout almost the entire, saw Sweden rise to its greatest glory. They not only expanded rapidly but also suppressed all resistance from. However, at a time when this empire seemed unshakable, a calamity pushed Sweden to the brink of collapse. Let's begin with the words. King Charles accepted. His people I do not oppose. Peace I own. Lasting. Too many countries want Sweden to weaken, and we must rely on our own strength, meaning we must fight to make others fear. The victory against the Russian army at Navarre made King Charles so despise this nation, and he decided to take a bold step to invade Russia with the ambition of destroying Moscow and overthrowing the Tsar, forcing Russia into submission, thereby completely ending any potential future Russian attacks on Sweden, creating peace for Sweden, as Charles Civ declared. He seemed certain that he and his army would win as it had before, but there were changes that Charles Civ failed to recognize in the 17th century when it was invaded by Gustavus the Great. Russia was a dying man during the Great War. The harsh winters from 1601 to 1603 brought crop failures, leading to famine and increasing social disorder, adding to the death toll. the successor to Ivan the Terrible's son. Peter I triggered a period of civil war, severely weakening German and Russian politics in the 17th century. For this reason, they easily lost much territory to foreign power, such as the Soviet Union, and Poland in the Russo-Bolshevik War, or the Swedish King Peter the Great. Peter the Great also took advantage of the turmoil to launch a military campaign against Russia, achieving a glorious victory. However, the situation during the reign of Charles VI was different. Russia, by the beginning of the 18th century, had revived both politically and economically under the leadership of Peter the Great. Therefore, Charles VI was no longer facing a chaotic nation, but unified Russia. This made the invasion of Russia dangerous because the Swedish army, not a very large force, nor did it have abundant. They won through discipline and steely resolve under the leadership of King Charles, and the unwavering determination he instilled in his generals and soldiers. This meant that the Swedish army would win in a swift, not a protracted one. Therefore, when facing a unified Russia, the Swedish army would have to engage in a war of attrition, as the Russian army could mobilize enormous resources, from manpower and food to weapons. Furthermore, in the previous war against the three-nation alliance of Denmark, Poland, and Russia, King Charles had depleted royal treasury to support his army. Therefore, his disregard for opposition and plunging the country into war with Russia caused serious internal divisions within the Swedish government in the 20th century. 18 was also a period instability in the feudal autocratic regimes of Europe. So, Charles VI's actions not only destabilized the country's politics, but also led to his assassination by his own soldier. However, domestic instability and fighting against a unified Russia were nothing compared to facing Peter the Great. The Swedish army suffered greatly through the scorched earth tactic. 1707, Charles VI led his army out of German control. 40,000 elite Swedish troops had landed on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, beginning their invasion of Russia. As Sweden advanced rapidly into Russian territory, Tsar Peter the Great ordered the destruction of a vast area so that the Swedish army could not harvest anything. Bridges, villages, towns, houses, and even scraps of food for people and horses were burned to the ground. In this way, the Russian army created a scorched earth zone, 200 miles long. The Russian encirclement stretched from all directions around the Swedish camp. Furthermore, wherever Charles VII advanced, the Russian army employed guerrilla tactics, gradually isolating the Swedish forces and cutting off their supplies. The battle, dry defeat, became increasingly apparent. This was the moment Europe unexpectedly received the worst frost in a vast Russian territory instantly became a mass grave. In some nights, over 2 Swedish soldiers died from the cold. By the Swedish Expeditionary Army had dwindled to only 20,000 men, their morale severely affected by hunger and cold. But instead of retreating to preserve their forces, Charles VI decided to continue the siege of Pava, city in Ukraine. The final outcome was that on June 27, 79, the Swedish army was defeated. The Russian army, with its force 4 times larger, equivalent, which was overwhelmingly outnumbered and morale-bound. This allowed the Russians to easily crush the Swedish army in mid-1709, a year after Sweden's initial invasion of Russia. With 40 troops now, King Charles VII was left with only 600 soldiers and had to flee Russia in haste. It wasn't Charles VI who was defeated, but Peter the Great. The fame of Peter the Great soared across Europe. The defeat seemed predetermined, stemming from Charles VI's overconfidence, the rise of Russia, Peter the Great's clever tactics, and even the unfavorable weather. But the nightmare of Russia for the Swedish Empire didn't end there. The 40,000 troops who fought in Russia, though not a huge number, were all elite soldiers. Today, we can all see this as an extremely risky gamble, because losing these troops would mean losing Swedish territory. Despite considerable protection, Charles VI failed to see it coming, and not only him, But the whole of Europe also failed to see it coming. When news of Sweden's invasion of Russia broke, politicians in many countries awaited news of another Swedish victory. Hope Swedish would advance into Moscow after Emperor Peter the Great would be replaced or, worse, killed. In the Imperial War, Sweden would become the ruler of the entire North, wielding power over all matters in the North and East, or Russia would shrink because of the Swedes, Poles, and perhaps even the Turks, Tatars, and Chinese who would divide and tear apart parts of the land. However, the result was completely the opposite. The Battle of Pavia in 79? Abrupt end to the Swedish imperial era. The defeat at Pavia. Swedish territory surrounded on many sides. After news of the Swedish army's defeat, Denmark, under Frederick IV, and the Elector, seized the opportunity. The Swedish military invasion, coupled with the Danish siege of the Netherlands in 1713, and Russia's sweeping military campaigns across the region, meant Sweden faced a multi-pronged siege. Worse still, the fact that successive monarchs were embroiled in continuous wars prevented Sweden from establishing significant political and cultural influence over its territories. Consequently, these lands would immediately change hands upon recapture, forcing Sweden to resort to stronger military measures. However, being surrounded on multiple fronts proved incredibly difficult. Further misfortune struck when, in 1718, Charles VI was assassinated, losing Northern Line. The Swedish Empire could no longer raise its voice, and instead, to prevent the war from reaching Stockholm, Sweden was forced to sign the Treaty of Fire. According to this, Sweden had to cede to Russia the territories of Ionia, which is the central and northern parts of present-day Latvia, Eel, which is Estonia, and which is the province of Leningrad and the city of St. Pit, and the southeastern part of Sweden. In the following years, Sweden still sought opportunities to declare war on the Russian Empire to regain the lost territories. Since the 12th century, the two countries had continuously clashed for territories around the Baltic Sea, but this time it was different. Peter the Great carried out a comprehensive military reform with the help of European commanders and engineers. The Russian army then adopted new military formations, and thereby achieving a balance of power with the Swedish army. In addition, after King Cha, Sweden had not produced another god of war. Therefore, when this king died, coupled with the loss of military advantage, the more Sweden fought, the more territory it lost. By 1809, Sweden was defeated in the war with Russia. The Empire and Finland were transferred to become autonomous states, under Russian rule for over 100 years in total. After wars throughout the 18th century, Sweden lost a third of its territory, and with the remaining population, Stockholm was no longer strong enough to compete with the Russian Empire. As a result, a Swedish territory fell at the feet of the Russians once and for all. Music.